We're going to just kind of pick up from where we left last week. Joshua 20, that was the cities of refuge. Who wants to give us a quick idea of what the cities of refuge were all about? What was it for? What were they? That was Joshua 20. What were the cities of refuge?
Well, they were set up so that if you accidentally killed somebody, you had a place that you could go. Mm-hmm. And you run through the city of refuge. The cities of refuge were basically the Levite cities. And you had to be judged while you were there, mm-hmm. but you could stay there. And in fact, I believe you had to stay there until the person who was high priest at that point in time died. And then you're supposed to go back. So you could be there for years.
Great.
Especially if you're young. But it gave you a place to go so that you didn't have to, so that the person whose family member or whatever you accidentally killed wouldn't kill you back.
All right.
Killed you back.
Just for accidental. However, we did do this. We went back to Genesis and found that when Noah came out of the ark, God specifically said, whoever sheds blood, his blood will be shed. And it wasn't qualified. You kill, you die. Now the question would be, well, what about accidental? Well, I don't know. God doesn't talk about that, so we just leave it. So what we have here is we have a qualification of the original promise. It's just repeated, but now it's qualified. If it's accidental, then God gave it through His grace. He gave a way that you could be protected, because the original law said you killed, you died. Didn't matter how you killed or what the circumstances. All right. So that was the cities of refuge, and there were 6 of them. Now remember, we're in the book of Joshua where they've divided up the land. They're inhabiting the land, the promised land, and it's been a process. And back in, I believe it was Numbers, it said that the bigger tribes would get the bigger land. Remember that? And the smaller tribes would get the smaller land. And that it was divided up by lot, meaning God was in charge. So they used their heads, but ultimately God was also working. So the high priest, Eleazar, would stand there with his Urim and Thummim. Remember the ephod, the apron that he had, and the stones? It's not explained how God would answer, but He would. He would answer through the stones. Whether they would light up or whatever, because one of them means light and the other means darkness, I believe. So it might be that they just shined, or maybe He reached into His pocket where He had some, He pulled one out. We don't know. But however it was, it's called lot, that God showed them. So they looked at the promised land. Remember, they sent the spies in again. Go check it all out. Come back and tell us. What's it look like? Okay, big tribes get big land. Small tribes, small land. But when we were reading in the book of Numbers, the tribe of Levi didn't get any land. They're not listed among the 12 tribes that got land. And the question is, well, what would happen to them? Where are they supposed to go? Well, Moses had been told by God that the Levites would inhabit cities. Okay, they wouldn't get big properties because the Levites, well, let me back up a minute. Levi was one of the sons of Jacob. But Levi wasn't a priest. He was just one of the sons. It wasn't until they left Egypt that God said, the tribe of Levi is a special tribe and they're not going to get land. All the other tribes are going to get land. Now, if you were of the tribe of Levi, you'd probably go, how fair is that? Everybody else gets land and we don't. But God described the scenario because the tribe of Levi is going to be sacred or set apart for a special purpose. They don't have to till the land. They don't have to have farms to take care of. because they're going to live differently. How are they going to live? Well, they're going to live off the what went on in the sacrifice. They were going to eat the meat. Where do you think the meat went to when they offered a sacrifice? When you brought a lamb and you sacrificed it, you didn't take it home. You left it at the tabernacle. Guess who would take it home? The Levites. They had, and I'm using my sanctified imagination here, okay? Shechem is where they had the tabernacle. The Levites probably, because they didn't have refrigeration, they didn't have big 18-wheeler haulers, what they call them, refrigerator trucks. They probably had to, if they lived far away, if the Levites were given a town far away, they had to get that meat home pretty quick because it would spoil. So they had to have a system of taking the food back to their homes. All right, so they were taken care of by the offerings given to the temple. Now, I'll tell you where I'm going with this, okay? Somebody said to me one time, there's nothing new under the sun. You've heard that, right? Yeah. There's a reason why we have the Old Testament in our Bible. Some people go, well, the Old Testament, that's all old stuff. We should just read the New Testament. No, because the Old Testament gives us the context for the New Testament. So what we are going to look at today when we read this, hopefully, we won't be here till midnight, don't worry, but we're going to look at what Paul says about a particular topic, and it's all based in the Old Testament. So what Paul teaches the church at Corinth is all based on what God had already showed them in the Old Testament about taking care of the Levites and how they were fed and how they were supported, etc., etc. Okay, so I'm going to lead up to that in a little bit. But chapter 20 then is when we have what's called the cities of refuge, meaning if someone killed accidentally, as Cindy said so eloquently, they could go and run and they were safe. Now, these are not, I think I said last week, they're not sanctuary cities, as some people are calling some of those today, where you can break the law and go hide. Not that. This is for accidental, not on purpose killing. You could go and be safe until you were judged, till the high priest died. All right, and I let the cat out of the bag, I think, last week, because I told you that these 6 cities, look at Joshua 20, verse 7 and 8. There's 6 of them. Guess what? They end up being cities that the Levites were given in the next chapter. So I kind of let the cat out of the bag a little bit there. But look at verse 7. They appointed, here they are, Kadesh in Galilee, in Mount Naphtali, Shechem in Mount Ephraim, Kirjath Arba, which is in Hebron, in the mountain of Judah. By the way, these are all high places. Interesting that these cities of refuge were not way down in the deserts. These were high. Oh yeah. So anyway, verse 8, on the other side of the Jordan by Jericho eastward, they assigned Bezer in the wilderness, on the plain of the tribe of Reuben, Ramoth in Gilead, out of the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan, the tribe of Manasseh. 6 of them. Now, let's go to chapter 21. In chapter 21, we have the dispersal of what's called the cities for the Levites. I find it interesting that the Levites got their inheritance last. Everyone else got theirs first. They got the last. So in chapter 21, it says, Then came near the heads of the fathers of the Levites, unto Eleazar the priest, and unto Joshua the son of Nun, unto the heads of the fathers of the tribes of the children of Israel. So you have the Levites coming. Now after everything's been divided up, they go to the 2 leaders. And it's almost like they're saying, whoa, 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 guys, hold on, hold on. What about us? Chapter 2, they spake unto them at Shiloh, in the land of Canaan, The Lord commanded by the hand of Moses to give us cities to dwell in, with the suburbs for our cattle. So the Levites did have cattle. What are they doing here? Well, God had already promised them that they would have cities, but it hasn't happened. So what are they doing? Now they're asking. Here's a principle you need to remember. Just because God promises it doesn't mean you're going to have it. You got to ask for it. James 4 says you have not because you ask not. Think of all the things God has promised in His Word. And if you don't get those promises out and plead with God, guess what? Just because it's a promise doesn't mean it automatically comes. So why did these Levites go to the leaders? Because they hadn't gotten their cities. It's almost like Joshua's like, okay, the work's done. Boy, what a, whew, I'm glad that's over. Wait, what about Levites? All right. So what we have from verses 3 on, I'm not going to read all of these, but here's the interesting thing. Every tribe gave up some of their cities. These cities belonged to the tribes. They were in the territories of those tribes. And so we have listed the tribes and then what city they gave up, or what cities. And what's interesting is the bigger tribes gave up more cities. The small tribes gave up less cities. Interesting. Paul says in 1 Corinthians, we're going to look at this, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay up in store as God has prospered you. You know what God does? According to how you're prospered, He wants you to give. If He's prospered you a lot, He wants you to give a lot. The tithe is based on the amount. Small amount, small tithe. Big amount, big tithe. Interesting. I'm just giving you a couple little thoughts to think about. Where's that come from? Old Testament. All right, so let's look at it. Verse 3. I'm not going to read all of them, but let's just see. Verse 3, the children of Israel gave to the Levites out of their inheritance. Out of their inheritance, they gave to the Levites. You see, they had already inherited. It was theirs. Now they're giving it up. We're going to get down to a verse here that I think will shock you. But let's keep going. They gave, it says, at the commandment of the Lord, the cities and their suburbs. So they gave up these cities to the Levites. Verse 4, the lot came out of the family of the Kohathites. I believe Aaron had 3 sons. I'll have to look that up, but I believe he did. So we're going to have 3 different groups of the Levites here. The Kohathites, the children of Aaron, the priests, had by lot out of the tribe of Judah, out of the tribe of Simeon, out of the tribe of Benjamin, 13 cities. So those guys gave up 13. The rest of the children of Kohath had by lot. See that word lot? That means that's how they determined it. God somehow was involved in the lot. The rest of the children of Kohath had by the lot of the family's tribe of Ephraim, tribe of Dan. We're going to have all 12 tribes mentioned here. 10 cities. Children of Gershon had by lot out of the families of the tribe of Issachar. So you have the Kohathites, Gershonites, out of the tribe of Asher, tribe of Naphtali, out of the tribe of Manasseh in Bashan, 13 cities. By the way, we're going to add all these up, and I think it's 48 cities that they got in all. We'll get that at the end there.
There's four groups.
What's that?
4 groups.
4 groups. The children of Merari, by their families, had out of the tribe of Reuben, out of the tribe of Gad, Zebulun, 12. Children of Israel gave, this verse 8, by lot unto the Levites these cities with their suburbs, as the Lord commanded by the hand of Moses. They gave out of the tribe of the children of Judah Now the tribe of the children of Simeon, these cities which here are mentioned by name, which the children of Aaron, being of the family of the Kohathites, who are the children of Levi, had for theirs, was their first lot. Now here's where it gets interesting. Look at this. Verse 11. And they gave them the city of Arba, the father of Anak, which is Hebron, in the hill country of Judah with the suburbs. Does Hebron ring a bell to anybody? Hebron. Let me refresh your memory. They're dividing up the land. Remember, Joshua and Caleb were the two original spies.
I was just telling him, Caleb was arguing that he got people.
Joshua and Caleb. And when they're dividing it up, Caleb goes, whoa, hold on a minute. I am 80-some, I think he was 85, it said there, 85 years old, and I'm just as strong as I was when I came. Would you just do one thing for me? Would you give me that mountain? Hebron. Look at it. Go back to Joshua 14. Just so you know I'm not making it up. Joshua 14. Caleb pleaded for one place. Please give me one place. Joshua 14:13. And Joshua blessed him. Well, let's read verse 12. Now therefore, verse 12. Give me this mountain whereof the Lord spake in that day, for thou heardest in the day how the Anakims were there, and the cities were great and fenced. If so be the Lord will be with me, I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. And Joshua blessed him, and gave Caleb the son of Jephunneh Hebron. Okay. Put yourself in Caleb's place. He's a member of this tribe. And by lot, it was determined they needed to give up Hebron.
Caleb got the.
Now, what would you think if you pleaded with Joshua and you were given that mountain, Hebron, that place, that high place, beautiful area, mountain with trees on the top? And then when they're dividing up the land for the Levites, the lot falls on your city that you were given.
So did Caleb actually go in there and conquer the giants that were there?
He probably did, because he was given the land and he went to work. He said, man, I'm strong. I'm going for it. All right. Now, we're not told a lot here, but I think we can read between the lines. You don't find Caleb objecting. You don't find Caleb going, but, hold it. That's my mountain. I was given that mountain. You know what he does? He gives it up. Which says a lot about Caleb. Caleb trusted his God. He was given something, and God took it away. Not in a bad way, but it went to the Levites. It went to the Lord for the service of the Lord.
It says they got the fields and the villages around it. That sounds like the main part, the best city.
Right. So I'm just throwing that out as what a character quality. Think of the character qualities of this man, Caleb. He could have screamed to high heaven, but that's mine. You're not touching mine. No, you don't. Let's read it. Verse 11. Now this is the tribe of Judah, given up what came up by lot. God's decision, they gave them the city of Hebron in the hill country, with the suburbs and the fields of that day and the villages they gave to Caleb the son of Jephunneh for his possession. But the fields they gave to Caleb. So the point is this. He was given that special place, but he was willing to step back and take maybe second place.
The Lord give it, the Lord take it away.
Yeah. Say, you know what? God gave it to me. I had it for a time. I fought. I got rid of Anakin and the kings and whatever. But if God wants it, it's his. Doesn't the Bible say he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills? Whose is it anyway? Let's just stop and apply. Who owns everything anyway? Isn't it God?
Yes.
So what if God says, I'd like to change managers. You've been managing it for a while. I'd like to give it to another manager. We don't often think of it that way. We don't think, because we think, well, I worked for it. I bought it. It's mine. End of discussion. Thank you. But hold on. We have an example here of a man who got something and he was willing to give up at least the Hebron part. It does say he kept some of the land around, but the best part.
Yeah, and he had to clean it out of the, he had to clear it for him.
Right. Yeah, he cleared the woods.
Giants, exactly.
Yeah.
Giants. I mean, man.
Now that I've done all the work, here you go.
So am I stepping on toes here? Am I being a little too, I don't know. You know what? I think God put it here for a reason, to help us to realize sometimes we need to be knocked down a notch or two, that we think we're all so high and mighty because it's ours and we bought it. You bought it, but who gave you the ability to work to get it? God. Right, right. So these are life lessons that we're seeing here. These are godly men who were willing to say to God, God, if it's for your work and it furthers your kingdom, you can have it. And I'll live in the land around. I still got land. It's not like I'm out on the street destitute. And he didn't give up everything, but he gave up the very best. Anyway, just thought I'd throw that out. Anybody want to comment on that? Does that make sense, Patty?
Because in 14 it says he wholly followed the Lord God of Israel. Right.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
God do.
So Caleb, maybe God could test him because he was of the quality that could be tested and come through the fire.
He was willing to go in there and do the job.
And he
Yeah.
was willing
Even at
to,
85.
he was willing to go in, originally too.
Yeah.
He and Joshua, that really trusted the Lord.
Could it
Wow.
also be that as a one who wholly followed the Lord, he would consider it a privilege to have the Levites town
Yeah.
in his area?
Yeah, think about that.
Yes, I want them there.
He had godly people.
Yeah, I wanted to be around godly people.
The godly priests living right there.
And a privilege to give something to the Lord, to give the
Yeah.
best. Like you're supposed to give the best thing.
Yeah.
If the priests are all there, that's, I would say
Right.
that that's some kind of a monument to God. I don't, I know he doesn't want great images.
Yeah.
But a reverence.
Yeah.
And he might say, heck yeah, take that. I want to revere the Lord.
And I don't have to walk very far to get to the weekly center.
Yeah. Right. Didn't have to walk very far to get to church. Roll out of bed and he's right there, Man, part of the privileges. All right, so Hebron is one of them. So what I want to do is I want to go back. We're going to kind of keep going back and forth to chapter 20, because in 27 and 8 you have listed all of the cities. And what I found is I found 4 of them, but I didn't find the last 2, so I don't know. Maybe they're renamed. I just always was told that the Levites got cities within these cities of refuge. But we'll see. We'll keep going. So verse 13, it says, they gave to the children of Aaron the priest Hebron with her suburbs, and it became a city of refuge for the slayer, and Libnah with her suburbs. So then we go down, we're just going to skip down some of these. Verse 17, the tribe of Benjamin gave up Gibeon and her suburbs, Geba with her suburbs, Anathoth. We don't know these cities, but it says there were 4 of them that they gave up. Then we jump down to verse 20. The families of the children of Kohath, the Levites, which remained of the children of Kohath, Even they had the cities of their lot out of the tribe of Ephraim, for they gave them Shechem. Now, if you go back to chapter 20, verse 7, Shechem is one of the cities of refuge. So it was also a city of the Levites. So it's serving dual purpose. You understand? It's a Levite city, but it's also a city of refuge.
Isn't Shechem?
Dinah
Yes, where Dinah.
Yes.
slaughtered the men.
Yes, where they dealt. They were not too nice back then.
Yeah.
Reuben and those guys were not too nice. All right. So then it says in verse 22, Kibzaim with their suburbs, Beth Horon, 4 cities. So let's keep going. And eventually we're going to get to 48 cities. If you count all of these up, if you're good at math, you'll get to it. Of the tribe of Dan, it says, verse 24, 4 cities. Half the tribe of Manasseh, verse 25, 2 cities. See, these are small tribes, so they're only giving small amounts. And that's okay. Then verse 27, unto the children of Gershon of the families of the Levites, out of the other half tribe of Manasseh, he gave Golan. Oh, go back to chapter 20, verse 7. Or actually verse 8. Golan is one of the cities of refuge. All right, so they gave that. And it even says in verse 27, with their suburbs to be the city of refuge.
Well, actually, Manasseh gave 4 cities. The half tribe gave 2.
Did I-
The other half tribe gave 2.
Yeah. 2 cities, 2 cities. Verse 30, tribe of Asher. I'm just skipping through some of these. Verse 32, out of the tribe of Naphtali, Kadesh. Oh, go back to chapter 20, verse 7. Kadesh is also a city of refuge. And we'll jump down to the last one. Verse 38, out of the tribe of Gad, Ramoth in Gilead. Ooh, you heard of that before. City of refuge. So again, these cities are Levite cities, but they're also cities of refuge. So they have 2 purposes. Which is interesting because if you killed someone accidentally, you were running to the best place you could run. You were running to a city full of priests, people that were dedicated to the temple. Who better to help you? All right, and then verse 41, it says, all the cities of the Levites within the possession of the children of Israel were 48 cities and their suburbs. These cities were everyone with their suburbs round about them, thus were all the cities. And the Lord gave unto Israel all the land which he sware to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and dwelt therein. Now this is probably the sweetest verse in the whole book. It says, verse 44, and the Lord gave them what? Rest. Round about, according to all he sware unto their fathers. And there stood not a man of all their enemies before them, and the Lord delivered all their enemies. Now, they still had more to conquer. They had to clear a lot of those other areas, but they didn't have people that were fighting against them at that point. Remember, they had taken care of all the kings. They had taken all the strongholds out. Now they had rest. The land is divided. The work is done. Well, the dividing work is done. Now they have to go possess it. Now they have to inhabit it. Now they have to live there. And God had given them vineyards that they hadn't planted. He gave them animals that they hadn't, or crops they hadn't grown, and animals that they hadn't brought with them, because the land was already productive. And God was blessing them beyond measure. Divided up proportionately to the size of the tribes. The Levites were positioned all around the promised land in 6 cities, or 6 cities of refuge, and then 48 cities of Levites. It should have worked perfectly. But what happens? What?
Only they've done their job.
Right? God had done everything for them. And we're gonna continue here with this in the following weeks. And there's not much more to go because we're almost at the end of Joshua. But you know what happens as soon as Joshua dies. They start following the ways of the people, the Canaanites. They start drifting away from God. They didn't have a leader. They didn't have a king. So God had to raise up judges to guide them through this. But at this point, the dividing of the land is done. Now, here's what I want to do. I want to turn you to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're just going to look at this quickly. I'm not going to spend all night on this, but the Apostle Paul he had neighbors that didn't like him too. And they criticized him. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Is it first? Yeah. And one of the things they said about him was, well, he shouldn't be an apostle because he wasn't one of the disciples. So they were trying to disqualify him. So let me read through this very quickly. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And here's how Paul defends his what we call apostleship. The fact that he could stand before them and say, the word of the Lord is, and he spoke as a spokesman of God. And he goes, am I not, look at verse 1, am I not an apostle? In other words, I have the authority, folks, to tell you this. Because he's come down pretty hard on them. He's having to correct some of the stuff going on in this church. There was abuse, the Lord's table. There was abuse with gifts of the Spirit. All kinds of abuse going on in this church. And he had to jump in there and correct it. I just thought of something the other day. If you're going to name your church, some people go like Berean Baptist Church or I don't know. Back where we're from, there was an inner city church called Corinthian Baptist Church. And I thought to myself, of all the churches, why would you call yourself Corinthian? They were like problematic. Paul probably lost all his hair over this church because they had so many issues. Why would you call yourself Corinthian Baptist? I don't know. Or they just thought that was a cool word, I don't know. All right, so here's Paul correcting these Corinthians. All right, here we go. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen the Lord Jesus Christ the Lord? He's answering questions they had. Paul, you weren't one of the disciples. You're not an apostle. And he goes, yeah, I did. I saw the Lord. I've seen him. Remember, I was on the way to Damascus and the Lord knocked me off my horse. So yeah, if I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you. For the seal of my apostleship are ye in the Lord. My answer to them that do examine me is this: have we not power to eat or drink? Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, as the brethren of the Lord and Cephas? He says, you know what? I'm doing the same work as the other apostles, Peter and others. Look at my track record. I'm serving God. Or, verse 6, I only and Barnabas, have not we power to forbear working? What's that mean? He says, you know what? I even have the authority to not work. I'm a minister of the gospel, and I can sit back and not work. Now, who in the Old Testament didn't have to work? The Levites. They didn't have to plow their fields. They didn't have to. How did they survive? By what came into the church. Or, well, I should say the tabernacle. Sacrifices. In fact, I can show you a verse in Numbers where not only that, but the tribes were required to give to the Levites. When they were harvesting their fields, they were supposed to give a certain amount of their harvest to the Levites. So those tribes that had a Levite city nearby, guess what? When they harvest their fields, they would drop off produce and stuff at the Levites' houses. They took care of them because the Levites didn't work. Now, work meaning in the world's eyes, they obviously worked in the Lord's work, but not what we might call secular. So Paul says here, verse 6, or I only and Barnabas, have not we the power to forbear? Don't you think that I can insist that you take care of me? Ooh, look at verse 7. Now he's going to give 3 analogies. Look at this. Who goes a warfare anytime at his own charges? That's the first one. When you send a soldier to war, do you expect that soldier to plow a field so he can feed himself? No. If you are a soldier representing a country or a people group, they support you, they feed you, they clothe you, they send you ammunition. Duh. So what he's saying is, I have every authority if I wanted to push it. Now he's not going to push it. But he says, I could say to you, you need to clothe me. You need to send me food. You need to support me because I'm your soldier. That's the first analogy. Look at the next one. Who plants a vineyard and eats not the fruit of it? Have you ever heard of somebody who plants a garden? We had a terrible garden this year. I won't even talk about it. We had these big old bugs that came and just killed our cucumbers.
And the grasshoppers fall.
And the grasshoppers ate all the leaves off the tomato plants. So we won't talk about that. But but who plants a garden and can't enjoy some of the fruit of it? That's what he says here.
Yeah.
I've planted churches. Don't I have the right to enjoy the fruit of my labor? Now look at the last one. Or who feeds a flock and doesn't eat the milk of the flock? If you have animals, don't you have the right to enjoy what comes from those animals? So what's he saying? I serve God. I have the authority, if I wanted to push it, to insist that you support me. Because I'm a soldier. I don't have to plow a field. I'm defending you. And then the second one there, who plants a vineyard? I've planted churches. Shouldn't I enjoy some of the fruit? Some of the benefits of that? Who feeds a flock and doesn't eat the milk of the goat? Now let's keep going. Say I these things as a man, or saith not the law the same also? Ooh, he says, look, I'm talking as a man, giving you some logic, but let's go back to the Old Testament. Let's go back and see some of the things that God was teaching his people. For it is written in the law of Moses, here it is, thou shalt not muzzle the mouth of the ox that treads out the corn. Does God take care of the oxen? That's Old Testament, folks. He's reaching back and he's going, remember that story? Remember what God said? If you have an animal that's working, he has the right to eat. Ooh. See why the Old Testament's important? Paul's using it as his foundation for his argument here. Keep going. All right, where did we stop? Oh, verse 10. Or saith he altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt. This is written, that he that plows should plow in hope, and he that threshes in hope should be a partaker of his hope. If we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing that we shall reap your carnal things? If others be partakers of this power over you, are not we rather? Nevertheless, we have not used this power. See, there's the key. Paul says, I have the right to insist, but I've never, ever insisted on it. I've been gracious. So how was the Apostle Paul supported? He was a minister of God. How was he supported? Well, some of his church, he worked, yeah. Tent maker at times, then he'd get enough money to move on and do more. Or some of the churches supported him. He received gifts. And I think we've mentioned this before. He even mentions that of all the churches that gave to him, the ones at Thessalonica, or the ones in that area, were the poorest. And they gave the most. I've asked the question, why would the poorest give the most? Because often those who lack, let's say, know what it's like to live without, and they're more sensitive. Could be. But see, that's how Paul lived. That's why he wrote the book of Philippians, thanking them for their gift for him. So what is he doing? Paul is saying to them, guys, remember the Old Testament? Remember the pattern that God set? That the people that were serving God back then lived off the fruit of their work. They were supported. What's that?
Even in Genesis, when they were setting up the priesthood, with the Ark of the Covenant, the priests, even then,
Yeah.
so there's precedent. is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Now, what's the difference? Let's just talk for a minute. You want to read verse 13?
Well, we stopped.
Do you not know, here it is, verse 13, that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple? Where's that coming from? Old Testament. And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar. Even so hath the Lord ordained that they which preach the gospel should live of the gospel. So what what Paul is saying here is, look, there was a pattern in the Old Testament. Much of that is brought over to the New Testament, but there are differences. Let me tell you one. You were born a Levite. You're not born a pastor. There's no family of pastors, right? There's no family of Christian workers. So there's a little difference. In the Old Testament, you were born into the Levite family. So you automatically, that was your job. You weren't a farmer, you were a Levite. That was your lot in life. And it was expected. Now, 1 Corinthians says, God has given the gifts as he wills. And one of the gifts is the gift of pastor, teacher, leaders, administrators. Those are gifted people, but God chooses those. There's no lineage of those. Are you following me? So there's a difference. It's a new, but there's a lot of patterns in the Old Testament that are carried over. I wrote down a couple. Similarity. The needs were provided for in the Old Testament. Similar today. Those who dedicate their lives 100% to the ministry of God, where do they eat their food? Where do they get their money? Well, it's provided by those who benefit from the work that they do. So that's similar. All right. In the New Testament, Paul told Timothy, let me show you this. You have to see this verse. 1 Timothy. You know, Timothy was a young guy. He was learning the ropes. He followed Paul around and he kind of took over. But Paul said some very good things to Timothy that I think are very instructive. Look at 1 Timothy 4:12. 1 Timothy 4:12. Let no man despise thy youth. Have you read that before? He says, Timothy, listen, you're a young guy, but you're a gifted guy. Don't let anyone despise your youth, but be an example of the believers in word, conversation, charity, spirit, faith, purity. Keep up the good work, Timothy. You're young. Don't let anybody despise. Verse 15, meditate upon these things. Well, verse 14, don't neglect the gift.
13 says, give attendance to reading.
See, all these things he's saying to him because he's a gifted man. He's not a Levite. He didn't come into this by birth. It's because God gifted him. So Paul is saying, look, you've been gifted, Timothy. Go for it. Meditate on these things. What's the difference? Well, I'm just thinking in my sanctified imagination, you're a Levite. You're born into the family. What do? Well, you just do what Levites did all the time. You take things to the temple, the tabernacle. You wash down the altar. Maybe you take the food home. It's a routines. It's been done. You're just born into the family and you keep doing it. What about the leaders in the New Testament? They're not born into the family. They're gifted. And then God says, now, here's what you need to do. And it's different for everybody. Pastors don't all do the same thing. I have a brother-in-law who's a pastor, and we were sitting down one time. You know who I'm talking about? And he says, well, why do you do this? And why do you do that? And I said, because God has me here and he has you there. You know, we're totally different. Totally different. His focus of ministry, right? He's a good guy. I'm not saying he's wrong. He's got his church and his focus is one thing and the focus somewhere else is different. But if you were a Levite, that wouldn't be the case. You'd be just doing the routine of Leviteness, whatever that is. But in the New Testament, you're gifted, and then you pursue the path God has for you, which may not look like anybody else's path. And that's the beauty of it. And that's why Paul could get a hold of guys like Timothy and go, Timothy, you're gifted. Don't neglect the gift. Study. Be a good example. Even though you're young, God's going to use you. How he's going to use you, where you're going to end up, I don't know. But God's going to use you. He may send you across the world to another nation. Levites never traveled. They were in their own city, doing their own thing for their whole life. But see, God's doing something different now. He gifts people and then sends them out. And who knows where they'll end up. But if they're walking with the Lord, he's going to use them in a mighty way. Are y'all following me here? All right. Last one I want you to see. Go to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 3. 1 Timothy 2, verse 3. He says to Timothy, endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. 2 Timothy 2, 3. Paul uses the example of a warrior. And then he says in verse 4, and this is where it would be, we're getting back to similar to the Old Testament. No man that wars entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who has chosen him to be a soldier. What's that mean?
Worshiping God.
If you're a soldier, you don't get to, just have a family and farm your farm, plant
Right.
flowers.
Watch it.
You're busy being a soldier.
A soldier is called to a different kind of lifestyle, right? Not that it's right or wrong. Farming is fine, but the Levites weren't allowed to do that. Why?
Pasture.
Because they were devoted to the Lord's work. All right. But Paul's using the same pattern, bringing it over to the New Testament and saying, Timothy, I want you to remember something. You've been gifted. You've been called. Study hard. Be a good example. Don't get entangled.
Don't get distracted.
That's what it is.
Not that it's wrong, but because God has gifted you, Timothy, you can't do what others do. Because for you, you got to think like a Levite. I don't have a possession. I don't have huge lands. I wasn't given tribal land because I was given the lot of being devoted to the Lord. So in that sense, it's similar. So what Paul is doing is, he's talking to young Timothy, but he's reaching back and bringing these principles to bear on the situation. Are you all following me here, or am I just kind of shooting the breeze? All right. So that can open a whole can of worms, but yeah, go ahead.
And pray tell, what are the modern day Levites doing?
Oh, good question. Well, after they were dispersed, and then it came back to the land, they've lost their tribal. Really, they don't have their genealogies anymore, so we don't even know who the Levites are. Yeah. In fact, if you remember when Ezra came back to the land to rebuild the temple, they had to use the ephod to determine who the priests were. They didn't even know. They lost all the records when Jerusalem was burned and destroyed. And then they were, picked out of the land and sent over there, and then, 70 years over there. They lost all recollection of what tribe they were. And so when they came back, Ezra wanted to get the temple going, and he's like, who are the priests? Oh, where are they? And one guy, I'm a Levite. Well, how do we know? Well, we better get someone here with the ephod, and let's ask God. Is this a Levite? He is. Oh, good, we got one. I'm a Levite. Come here. Are you a Levite? Let's ask God. Get out of here. So, no. No. Because, like I say, they lost their records of it. But the application is that God is doing something different now. And He gifts His ministers from no matter what background you are. If He chooses to gift you as a minister of the gospel or ministry, that's His choice.
But you're still representing His trees.
Right. Yeah.
So the application for today about a pastor
Verse 10.
can be like what we read in 1 Corinthians, where Paul said he works so that he's not dependent on people, so that they can't use that against him and say,
Right.
you're just doing it for the money.
Right.
So there are pastors who are tent makers, what we call tent makers. They work, like a church this size, you have to work in order to, make up the difference, so that we're not
Right.
in it for the money, or we're always worrying about the income. But look at the big churches in the U.S. today.
Yeah.
Fights are about money. Right. And, it's one of the worst things to happen to
Yeah.
people in the ministry, is when that money taints their whole motivation.
Yeah. And I've said it, you all have heard my bias or my opinion. As Dr. Harrison has said, there are shepherds and then there's hirelings. In John chapter 10, you read it. Jesus said, I'm the good shepherd. I give my life for the sheep. And then there are hirelings, which are people that are hired for the job. And when the thief comes, they're out. They're gone. Because they don't care. It's a job. They're not really there for the sheep. So we even have that today. We have those who say, well, I'm a shepherd, but as soon as the problem comes or whatever, they're threatened. I'm out of here. I don't need this. So we have that today. That is true. But let me close by saying this. If you were a Levite, you couldn't tent make. You were not allowed to go and have your fields and support yourself, because God said that the Levites will only be supported by the gifts of the people. That's the law. But now we're in the New Testament, where God is changing it, but He's using a lot of the same principles and saying that God's workers should be supported by the people that they're ministering to, but as in Paul's case, they could support themselves part-time too. So, all right. I just wanted to throw that out as we read the Old Testament. Remember that the Old Testament is the context for the New Testament. You can't read the New Testament without seeing what God was doing all through those years, preparing His people for what was coming. All right. Any questions? Clear as mud? Oh, okay. All right, let's pray. Dear God, we thank you. Thank you for working in the hearts of your people, the Jews, for putting these things into place, these patterns, for showing us your heart for people, your heart that shows that people need to be cared for as sheep, that they need to be led, need to be taught. We thank you for the New Testament. We thank you for the examples of Paul and Timothy and Barnabas and others that really cared for the people and were willing to endure. and didn't usurp authority over them, didn't pull rank, but they lovingly worked with people. Then if they had to, they worked to supply their own needs. But thank you for taking care of them. Paul did say, my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches and glory. Because he knew that it was ultimately God who takes care of his people, him and others. So Lord, we thank you for this. Take us home safely, we pray. Thank you for this good time together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
All right.